Imagine standing in the darkness of a foreign land, thousands of miles from home, watching something that seemed utterly impossible. Picture the faces of hardened military officers, men who had witnessed the might of the German war machine, men who had seen their factories produce tanks and planes with legendary efficiency, suddenly frozen in disbelief. Their eyes widened as they looked across the vast American landscape and saw something that defied everything they knew about industrial warfare. Factory after factory blazed with light through the night, their smokestacks reaching toward the stars, their assembly lines never stopping, never resting, never slowing down. These German officers had come to America as prisoners of war, expecting to find a nation soft and unprepared, a country that talked big but could not match the industrial discipline of the Third Reich. Instead, they witnessed a sight so overwhelming, so impossibly powerful, that it shattered their understanding of what was possible. The factories ran all night. They ran all day. They ran through weekends and holidays. They ran with a fury and determination that seemed almost inhuman. This was the moment when these officers realized that Germany had not just underestimated America, they had fundamentally misunderstood what this nation could become when pushed to its limits. This is the story of how American industry became the unstoppable force that changed the course of World War II, and how the very men who had fought against it came to witness its terrifying power with their own eyes. To understand the shock that gripped these German officers, we must first travel back to a world on the edge of catastrophe. In the years before World War II erupted across Europe, Germany had rebuilt itself from the ashes of World War I with frightening speed and efficiency. The Treaty of Versailles had left Germany broken, humiliated, and economically devastated. But from this ruin rose a new industrial machine designed specifically for war. German factories operated with precision that amazed the world. They produced weapons, vehicles, and aircraft using methods that seemed years ahead of other nations. The assembly lines moved with clockwork accuracy, and German engineering became synonymous with quality and innovation. Workers were organized, disciplined, and driven by a nationalist fervor that pushed production to impressive levels. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, America appeared to be sleeping through the gathering storm. The Great Depression had crushed American industry, leaving millions unemployed and factories silent. Production had slowed to a crawl, and many industrial facilities sat empty and rusting. The American military was small, underfunded, and using equipment that seemed outdated compared to the modern weapons being produced in Germany. German military planners looked at America and saw a nation divided by its own problems, more concerned with soup lines than military might. They saw a country that had grown soft during peacetime, a nation of consumers rather than warriors. Intelligence reports suggested that American factories were slow, inefficient, and incapable of matching German industrial output. This assessment would prove to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in military history. Everything changed on December 7, 1941, when Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. The attack killed thousands of Americans and destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet, but it accomplished something that no amount of political speeches or warnings could have achieved. It unified America with a fury that stunned the world. Within days of the attack, the entire character of American industry began to transform. Factories that had been producing cars suddenly retooled to build tanks. Plants that made refrigerators began producing ammunition. Tire factories switched to making gas masks and life rafts. The transformation happened with breathtaking speed, as if the entire nation had been waiting for permission to unleash its true potential. President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress and outlined production goals that seemed utterly fantastic. He called for 50,000 aircraft in a single year, a number that made military planners shake their heads in disbelief. He demanded tens of thousands of tanks, millions of rifles, and ships in quantities that had never been imagined. Critics said it was impossible. They said American industry was not capable of such miracles. They were wrong. The government poured resources into factory construction and expansion at a pace never seen before. New facilities were built in months instead of years. Existing factories doubled and tripled in size. But more importantly, something fundamental changed in how these factories operated. American industrialists realized that the traditional approach of shutting down at night and on weekends was a luxury the nation could no longer afford. If America was going to supply not just its own military but also its allies around the world, the factories would need to run constantly, around the clock, without pause. The decision to run factories 24 hours a day seems simple now, but in the early 1940s, it represented a radical transformation of American industrial culture. Before the war, most factories operated a single 8-hour shift during daylight hours. Workers went home to their families each evening, and the machinery fell silent until the next morning. This pattern had been standard practice for decades, shaped by tradition, labor agreements, and the assumption that nighttime production was inefficient and dangerous. But war does not respect tradition, and survival demands innovation. Factory managers began implementing multiple shifts that kept production lines running continuously. The first shift worked from morning until afternoon, the second shift took over until late at night, and the third shift, the graveyard shift, worked through the darkness until dawn. This meant that machines never cooled down, assembly lines never stopped moving, and materials flowed through the system without interruption. The efficiency gains were staggering. A factory running 3 shifts could potentially triple its output, but the reality proved even more dramatic. Continuous operation meant less downtime for starting up and shutting down equipment. It meant materials and partially finished products could move smoothly from one stage to the next without waiting. It meant that the enormous overhead costs of maintaining a factory were spread across many more hours of productive work. The American industrial system had discovered a force multiplier that Germany, despite all its efficiency and discipline, had not fully exploited. German factories ran long hours, certainly, but they still observed breaks and shutdowns that American plants increasingly eliminated. The difference seemed small on paper, but across thousands of factories and millions of workers, it created a production advantage that would prove decisive. Behind every tank, every plane, and every ship that rolled out of American factories stood an army of workers whose story is often overlooked. These were not professional soldiers, but they fought their own crucial battle on the home front. They came from every corner of American society, and they transformed themselves into the most productive workforce the world had ever seen. Women entered factories in numbers that shattered every social expectation of the era. Before the war, women in manufacturing were rare, confined mostly to textile work or light assembly. But as millions of men left for military service, women stepped forward to fill the void. They became welders, riveters, machine operators, and skilled technicians. They proved they could handle heavy machinery, work with dangerous materials, and maintain the punishing pace of wartime production. These women, symbolized by the iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, worked the night shifts alongside men, their welding torches casting long shadows in the darkness. African Americans found new opportunities in war factories, though they still faced discrimination and segregation. Many had been trapped in agricultural work or menial jobs before the war, but factory work offered better wages and a chance to prove their capabilities. They worked the hardest shifts, often the night shifts that others avoided, and their labor contributed directly to Allied victory even as they continued fighting for civil rights at home. Older workers who had been considered unemployable during the Depression suddenly found themselves valued for their experience. Teenagers lied about their ages to get factory jobs, eager to contribute to the war effort. Disabled workers found positions that utilized their abilities rather than focusing on their limitations. The American workforce became a true cross-section of society, united by a common purpose that transcended the divisions that had separated them before the war. To truly appreciate what German officers witnessed, we must understand the scale and intensity of American wartime production. Consider the Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by the Ford Motor Company to produce B-24 Liberator bombers. This single factory covered more ground than 100 football fields under a single roof. At its peak, Willow Run produced one complete bomber every 63 minutes, working around the clock. The assembly lines stretched more than a mile long, and workers could ride bicycles to move from one end to the other. The plant employed over 40,000 workers across 3 shifts, and the lights never went out. The noise was constant, a symphony of riveting guns, metal cutters, and rolling machinery that echoed day and night. When German officers later saw photographs or visited such facilities, they struggled to comprehend the sheer magnitude. German aircraft production, impressive as it was, could not match this scale. The Reich had many factories, but none approached the concentrated, continuous output of plants like Willow Run. In shipyards along both coasts, the transformation was even more dramatic. Before the war, building a large cargo ship took nearly a year. American shipyards cut that time to months, then weeks. Henry Kaiser's shipyards on the West Coast pioneered revolutionary techniques of prefabrication and welding that allowed Liberty ships to be assembled in an average of 42 days. At the peak of production, Kaiser's yards launched a new ship every single day. These yards operated under floodlights through the night, with welding arcs creating an otherworldly glow visible for miles. Workers in one shift would complete entire sections of a ship that the next shift would integrate into the growing hull. The yards became cities of light in the darkness, never resting, never pausing, driven by an urgency that everyone understood. America needed these ships to carry supplies across submarine-infested waters, and every day of delay meant lives lost and battles lost. When German prisoners of war began arriving in America in significant numbers starting in 1943, they expected internment in a struggling nation rationing resources and barely holding on. Instead, they found themselves in a land of almost incomprehensible abundance and activity. The psychological impact of this discovery cannot be overstated. These were men who had been told that Germany's enemies were weak, disorganized, and incapable of sustained industrial effort. They had been assured that American society was too divided, too soft, too undisciplined to compete with German efficiency. Many German officers held doctorates in engineering or had extensive industrial experience. They understood factory operations, production logistics, and manufacturing principles. When they saw American factories operating at full capacity through the night, they recognized immediately what it meant. This was not just impressive, it was terrifying. They calculated in their minds what this level of production meant for the war effort. They understood that every hour these factories ran all night represented tanks, planes, and artillery that would be used against German forces. Some officers reported feeling physically ill when they first witnessed the scale of American production. They realized that Germany could not win a war of industrial attrition against such capacity. One captured Luftwaffe officer, after being taken to observe a bomber plant, reportedly sat in stunned silence for hours, finally murmuring that Germany had been doomed from the moment America entered the war. Another officer, an engineer who had worked in German aircraft factories, watched an American assembly line and noted that in the time he observed, more fighters were completed than his entire German factory produced in a week. The psychological warfare value of exposing prisoners to American industrial might was not lost on American authorities. They deliberately arranged tour and transportation routes that showcased factories in full operation. The message was clear and devastating. You cannot win, resistance is futile, the American industrial machine is unstoppable. Statistics often fail to capture human drama, but in the case of American wartime production, the numbers themselves tell an almost unbelievable story. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft of all types. Germany, by comparison, produced approximately 120,000 aircraft over the same period. American factories manufactured over 88,000 tanks compared to Germany's 46,000. American shipyards launched over 5,700 Liberty ships alone, not counting the thousands of other vessel types, while Germany struggled to replace its submarine fleet as fast as the boats were being sunk. The automotive industry transformed itself with remarkable speed. General Motors alone produced over $200 million worth of war materials every month at the height of production. Ford, Chrysler, and dozens of smaller manufacturers matched this pace. Factories that had never built military equipment became expert in producing items they had never imagined making. A typewriter company began manufacturing machine guns with precision and speed that impressed military inspectors. A jukebox manufacturer switched to producing ammunition. A toy company began making compasses and measuring instruments for the military. But beyond these impressive totals lies an even more significant reality. American production kept increasing year after year throughout the war. While German output peaked in 1944 and then began declining under Allied bombing, American production continued growing. The factories running all night meant that America could simultaneously equip its own growing military, supply Britain and the Soviet Union with massive amounts of material through Lend-Lease, replace losses from combat, and still build up reserves for future operations. German planners had hoped that American production would be slow to mobilize and that Germany could win the war before American industrial might made a difference. Instead, American production mobilized faster than anyone predicted and sustained itself at levels that exceeded the wildest projections. Running factories all night required more than just adding electric lights and hiring additional workers. It demanded technological innovation and systematic problem-solving that pushed American industry to develop new methods and tools. The challenges were numerous and complex. Machines that had been designed to run 8 hours a day with regular maintenance breaks now needed to operate continuously for days or weeks at a time. This required improvements in lubrication systems, cooling systems, and component durability. American engineers redesigned equipment to be more robust and easier to maintain without shutting down entire production lines. They developed quick-change tooling systems that allowed worn parts to be swapped out in minutes rather than hours. They created better lighting systems that allowed precision work to continue through the night with the same accuracy as daylight operations. Quality control became a critical concern when production never stopped. American factories implemented statistical quality control methods that had been pioneered but underutilized before the war. These techniques allowed inspectors to identify problems quickly and make corrections before large numbers of defective items were produced. Inspection stations were integrated throughout the production process rather than just checking finished products, ensuring that problems were caught early. The logistics of feeding materials to factories that never stopped demanded sophisticated supply chain management. Railroads ran special schedules to ensure that raw materials arrived exactly when needed. Warehouses operated around the clock to receive shipments and distribute materials to factory floors. The entire system became synchronized in a way that previous peacetime production had never required. Communication systems improved dramatically. Factories installed telephone networks that allowed managers to coordinate between shifts and departments instantly. Production schedules were tracked hour by hour rather than day by day, allowing quick responses to problems or opportunities to increase output. This level of coordination became a permanent improvement in American industrial practice that continued benefiting the economy long after the war ended. The factories that ran all night created unprecedented production numbers, but this achievement came at a significant human cost that deserves recognition. Working the night shift, especially week after week for years, takes a severe toll on human health and family life. Night shift workers struggled with chronic fatigue, disrupted sleep patterns, and health problems related to working against their natural biological rhythms. Accidents increased during late-night hours when human alertness naturally declines. Despite safety improvements, the combination of heavy machinery, dangerous materials, and tired workers led to injuries and deaths. Explosions at ammunition plants killed dozens of workers at a time. Industrial accidents crushed limbs, burned skin, and caused lifelong disabilities. Workers accepted these risks because they understood the importance of their work, but the cost was real and lasting. Families adapted to schedules where mothers and fathers barely saw each other or their children. Some couples worked opposite shifts and communicated through notes left in their homes, passing each other like ships in the night. Children grew up with parents who were often sleeping during the day and absent at night. The traditional rhythms of family dinners and shared evenings disappeared for millions of American households. Women working night shifts faced additional challenges and dangers. They traveled to and from work in darkness, sometimes facing harassment or assault. They managed households during whatever hours they were not working, often surviving on just a few hours of sleep. They challenged social norms that said women belonged at home, and they paid a price in exhaustion and social judgment from those who disapproved of their choices. The stress of wartime production affected mental health in ways that were barely understood at the time. Workers dealt with anxiety about loved ones fighting overseas, pressure to meet production quotas, and the grinding exhaustion of continuous work. Some suffered breakdowns. Others turned to alcohol or other destructive coping mechanisms. The support systems we have today for mental health simply did not exist then, and workers were expected to simply endure. Yet despite all these costs, workers continued showing up shift after shift, night after night, year after year. They understood that their work saved lives on the battlefield. They knew that every tank they built might protect an American soldier, that every plane might bring a bomber crew home safely, that every ship might deliver vital supplies that would shorten the war. This sense of purpose sustained them through the hardest times and became a source of pride that lasted their entire lives. As more German prisoners arrived in America and more captured documents were analyzed after the war, a clear picture emerged of how German leadership gradually realized the catastrophic implications of American industrial capacity. Early in the war, German intelligence reports minimized American productive capability. Reports suggested that American claims about production goals were propaganda designed to boost morale rather than realistic assessments. German leaders convinced themselves that American society was too individualistic and undisciplined to organize effective mass production under wartime pressure. By 1943, as the tide of war began turning against Germany, intelligence assessments became more alarmed. Reports filtering back from prisoners and from agents in neutral countries described factory operations that seemed impossible by German standards. German military planners began recalculating their strategic assumptions and realized with growing horror that they had fundamentally misunderstood American potential. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, later wrote in his memoirs about the moment he truly understood that Germany could not match American production. He described reviewing intelligence reports about American factory operations and feeling a sense of doom settle over him. He realized that even if German production operated at maximum efficiency, even if every German factory ran continuously, the gap was too large to overcome. The tonnage of bombs American factories produced exceeded what Germany could manufacture, even if every bomber crew and soldier had unlimited weapons. Some German generals began advocating for negotiated peace once they understood the production numbers, knowing that continuing the war against such industrial superiority was suicidal. Hitler refused to acknowledge reality, but many officers quietly understood that defeat was mathematically certain. The factories running all night had sealed Germany's fate. Captured documents revealed German attempts to disrupt American production through sabotage, but these efforts proved futile. American counterintelligence and factory security were too effective, and even successful sabotage would barely slow the flood of production. German submarines tried to sink American cargo ships faster than they could be built, but the shipyards produced vessels faster than U-boats could destroy them. Every German strategy ran into the immovable obstacle of American industrial capacity operating at full speed, day and night, without pause. The impact of American factories running all night extended far beyond simply producing war materials. It fundamentally altered the balance of power worldwide and changed the course of history in ways that continue echoing today. Britain, standing alone against Germany through much of 1940 and 1941, would likely have been forced to negotiate peace without American production support. Even before America entered the war, Lend-Lease deliveries of tanks, planes, and supplies kept Britain in the fight. Once America joined the war, the flood of materials increased exponentially. British factories could focus on areas where they had advantages, while American production filled gaps and provided overwhelming quantity. The Soviet Union, facing the full fury of the German military, survived partially because American factories ran all night producing trucks, jeeps, food, raw materials, and weapons that poured into Russia through dangerous supply routes. Soviet factories had been evacuated east ahead of the German advance and were struggling to rebuild production. American supplies arrived at critical moments, providing the Red Army with mobility and logistical support that proved decisive in major battles. Soviet Marshal Zhukov later acknowledged that the Red Army could not have mounted many of its offensives without American trucks and supplies. The Pacific War became winnable because American shipyards and aircraft plants produced vessels and planes in numbers that simply overwhelmed Japanese capacity. Japan had started the war with experienced crews and good equipment, but could not replace losses as fast as America inflicted them. Every night that American factories operated brought Japan closer to inevitable defeat through sheer attrition. American pilots might have less experience than Japanese veterans, but they flew newer planes in greater numbers, and when planes were lost, replacements arrived quickly. Smaller Allied nations received equipment they could never have produced themselves. American factories supplied Free French forces, Chinese armies fighting Japan, resistance movements across Europe, and dozens of other groups. This generosity was possible only because production so far exceeded even America's own needs that materials could be shared widely without significantly impacting American military operations. The factories running all night did not just produce weapons. They produced profound social changes that reshaped American society permanently. The movement of women into factory work challenged assumptions about gender roles that had persisted for generations. Women proved they could handle any job men could do, and this realization planted seeds for the women's rights movements that would flourish in later decades. While many women returned to traditional roles after the war, the memory of their capabilities remained, and their daughters would draw on this history when demanding equality. African Americans who worked in war factories gained industrial skills and economic resources that supported the growing civil rights movement. They had proven their loyalty and capability under pressure, making segregation and discrimination harder to justify. Many veterans returning from the war had fought alongside black soldiers and could no longer accept the racist assumptions they had grown up with. The GI Bill, combined with wartime savings from factory work, allowed millions to afford education and homes that had been impossible dreams before the war. The geographical shift of population continued after the war as workers who had moved to industrial centers decided to stay. California's population exploded as workers who had come for shipyard and aircraft jobs remained in the sunny climate. The industrial Midwest grew dramatically as factories that had expanded for war production converted to peacetime manufacturing. The South began industrializing more rapidly as workers who had tasted factory wages demanded similar opportunities at home. Labor unions grew powerful through their role in organizing war production, negotiating agreements that balanced productivity needs with worker welfare. The cooperation between unions, management, and government during the war created models for labor relations that influenced decades of industrial policy. Workers gained benefits like health insurance and pensions that became standard expectations rather than rare privileges. The technological and organizational innovations developed to keep factories running all night spread throughout the economy. Manufacturing became more efficient, quality control improved, and supply chain management became more sophisticated. These improvements helped fuel the post-war economic boom that made America the world's dominant economic power for decades. Let us return to those German officers standing in the night, watching American factories blaze with light and activity. Try to imagine what went through their minds in those moments. These were intelligent, educated men who understood exactly what they were seeing. They were not ordinary soldiers who might fail to grasp the significance. They were officers, engineers, and strategists who could calculate implications with frightening clarity. Some of them had visited America before the war as students or tourists and remembered a nation struggling through economic depression. They had seen factories sitting idle and workers standing in bread lines. Now they witnessed those same factories operating with intensity that exceeded anything in their experience. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. They had been taught that German organization and discipline were superior to anything the decadent democracies could achieve, yet here was evidence that shattered that fundamental belief. For some officers, the experience produced a crisis of faith in everything they had been told about the war. If the leadership had been so catastrophically wrong about American industrial capacity, what else might be wrong? Doubts about ideology, strategy, and ultimate victory began creeping into minds that had been certain of German superiority. These doubts spread through prisoner camps as returning prisoners told their stories. Other officers retreated into denial, insisting that what they had seen was somehow faked or exaggerated. They could not accept evidence that contradicted their worldview, so they rationalized it away. These men clung to hopes of secret weapons or miracle scenarios that would somehow reverse the verdict that American production had already delivered. A few officers experienced something approaching despair. They had served with dedication and bravery, they had believed in their cause, and now they confronted undeniable proof that their sacrifice had been futile from the beginning. The war had been lost before it truly began, lost in the contest of factory floors rather than battlefields. Their comrades were dying in battles that could not ultimately be won because the enemy's factories never slept, while German production could not keep pace. The story of German officers shocked by American factories running all night contains lessons that extend far beyond World War II history. It demonstrates the danger of underestimating opponents based on prejudice and ideology rather than realistic assessment. German leadership had convinced themselves that democracy made nations weak, that diversity created division rather than strength, and that a society focused on individual freedom could not mobilize effectively. Every one of these assumptions proved tragically wrong. The power of industrial capacity in modern warfare became undeniable. Previous wars had been decided by courage, tactics, and the quality of individual soldiers and commanders. World War II proved that industrial production could be more decisive than battlefield brilliance. Germany produced the world's first jet fighters, developed rocket technology, and created some of the war's best tanks and weapons. But none of these innovations could overcome the sheer quantity of adequate equipment that American factories produced while running all night. The story also reveals the extraordinary potential that exists in free societies when unified by clear purpose. American workers were not coerced into factory service. They volunteered, driven by patriotism and shared commitment to defeating aggression. They worked harder and produced more than conscripted workers in totalitarian systems, shattering assumptions about which system could mobilize more effectively. Women and minorities who had been excluded from full economic participation proved essential to victory, demonstrating the cost of discrimination and the benefits of inclusion. The factories running all night also demonstrated the importance of adapting quickly to new circumstances. American industry transformed itself with remarkable speed, abandoning peacetime assumptions and traditional practices to meet wartime demands. The willingness to try new approaches, to experiment, to fail and learn quickly, gave American production crucial advantages over more rigid systems that struggled to adapt. Perhaps most importantly, the story reminds us that capabilities hidden during peacetime may emerge dramatically when challenged. America appeared weak and divided in the late 1930s, but possessed latent strengths that became overwhelming once mobilized. Nations and people should not be judged solely by their current state, but by their potential when motivated by sufficient cause. When the war ended in 1945, the full scope of what American factories had accomplished became clear through detailed analysis and comparison. Historians and economists studied production records and interviewed participants to understand how such dramatic output had been achieved. The consensus emerged that continuous operation, factories running all night, had been a crucial force multiplier that distinguished American production from all competitors. German prisoners of war gradually returned home to a shattered nation, carrying with them memories of what they had witnessed. Some wrote about their experiences, describing the shock and awe they felt when confronted with American industrial might. Their accounts provide valuable historical testimony about how the enemy perceived American home front efforts. These former officers returned to help rebuild Germany, and many applied lessons learned from observing American methods. The German economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s owed something to understanding gained by those who had witnessed American industrial practices during the war. American factories gradually converted back to peacetime production, but they never entirely returned to pre-war practices. The innovations developed to sustain night and day production proved valuable in peacetime competition. Many factories continued operating multiple shifts because the efficiency gains were too significant to abandon. The organizational methods, quality control practices, and supply chain management developed during the war became standard industrial practice. Workers who had labored through the night during the war carried pride in their achievement throughout their lives. They had not fought on foreign battlefields, but they had served their country just as surely. As they aged, they told stories to children and grandchildren about the factories that never slept, about the exhausting shifts, about the sense of purpose that sustained them through the hardest years. Their contributions eventually received greater recognition as historians documented home front efforts more thoroughly. The factories themselves often did not survive into the 21st century. Many were demolished as American industry evolved and relocated. But photographs and documentary footage preserve images of these facilities in their wartime glory, lights blazing in the darkness, smokestacks silhouetted against night skies, parking lots full of workers' cars at 3 in the morning. These images stand as monuments to what was achieved when an entire nation committed itself fully to a common purpose. Looking back with historical perspective, we can see that German failure to accurately assess American industrial potential was not merely an intelligence failure, but a fundamental strategic blindness rooted in ideology and prejudice. Nazi leadership had built its worldview on assumptions of racial and cultural superiority that made objective assessment impossible. They looked at American democracy, ethnic diversity, and consumer culture and saw only weakness and decadence. They could not imagine that these very characteristics might become sources of strength under the right circumstances. This blindness extended to specific miscalculations that compounded throughout the war. German planners assumed American workers would resist regimentation and long hours, failing to understand that free workers fighting for a cause they believed in might work harder than conscripted labor under totalitarian control. They assumed American industry was inefficient and wasteful, not recognizing that peacetime inefficiency could be rapidly eliminated when necessity demanded. They assumed American society was too divided by race, class, and politics to unify effectively, not anticipating how external attack would crystallize national unity. German intelligence collected some accurate information about American production capacity, but this information was filtered through assumptions that distorted its meaning. Reports of ambitious production goals were dismissed as propaganda rather than taken as serious warnings. Evidence of rapid factory expansion was explained away as temporary efforts that could not be sustained. Even when prisoners began reporting what they had witnessed, their accounts were often dismissed by leadership that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The cost of this strategic blindness was total defeat and the destruction of the German nation. Had German leadership accurately assessed American potential, they might never have declared war, might have pursued different strategies, or might have sought negotiated peace earlier before unconditional surrender became the only option. The factories running all night were not just producing weapons, they were delivering an inevitable verdict that German leadership refused to acknowledge until far too late. This historical lesson remains relevant today. Nations that allow ideology to override realistic assessment of opponents' capabilities court disaster. The temptation to see enemies through the lens of contempt and to dismiss their potential is psychologically satisfying but strategically suicidal. Reality eventually enforces accurate accounting, and the cost of learning this lesson in war is catastrophic. Among all the stories of factories running all night, the contributions of women deserve special emphasis because their role was so unexpected and so crucial. Before the war, women working in heavy industry at night would have been considered scandalous, inappropriate, and probably impossible. Cultural assumptions about female capabilities and proper gender roles seem to make women unsuitable for the demanding, dangerous work of wartime production. These assumptions evaporated under the pressure of necessity. As millions of men entered military service, women had to fill the gap or production would fail. Women stepped forward in numbers that exceeded all predictions, and they shattered every stereotype about what they could accomplish. They operated machinery just as effectively as men. They learned technical skills just as quickly. They maintained the punishing pace of night shift work week after week. They handled dangerous materials and worked in difficult conditions without complaint. The image of women working through the night in war factories became iconic, symbolized by posters and propaganda that celebrated their contributions. But the reality behind the image was even more impressive than the mythology. Women working night shifts had to manage everything that made such schedules difficult for men, plus additional challenges. They faced harassment and skepticism from male coworkers and supervisors who initially doubted their abilities. They earned lower wages than men for the same work. They managed households and childcare responsibilities during whatever hours they were not working, often with minimal support because wartime conditions disrupted traditional family structures. Some women worked the night shift while their husbands worked days, meaning the couple barely saw each other and had to coordinate childcare like a relay race. Some sent children to stay with relatives because managing childcare across night shift schedules proved impossible. Some brought children to factory-based childcare centers that operated around the clock, dropping off sleeping toddlers at midnight and picking them up 8 hours later. The physical toll was severe. Night shift work disrupts natural biological rhythms and can lead to chronic health problems. Women endured this knowing the cost, but believing the cause justified the sacrifice. They suffered the same industrial accidents that injured men, but often received less support and faced greater social judgment when injuries left them disabled. Despite all obstacles and challenges, women working night shifts in war factories proved conclusively that gender did not limit capability in any fundamental way. This proof could not be erased after the war ended. Though many women returned to traditional roles when men returned from military service, the memory remained. They had done the impossible, and their daughters would draw on this history when demanding equal opportunities in subsequent decades. While World War II eventually ended, some aspects of what began during those years never truly stopped. The practice of running factories continuously through multiple shifts, pioneered or expanded during the war, became standard practice in many industries because the efficiency gains were too significant to abandon. Modern manufacturing still relies on continuous operation principles developed when American factories first blazed through the night to supply a desperate war effort. The organizational innovations created to coordinate round-the-clock production evolved into modern supply chain management and just-in-time manufacturing. The quality control methods developed to maintain standards when production never paused became foundations of modern industrial quality assurance. The rapid problem-solving techniques that kept assembly lines moving through the night transformed into continuous improvement philosophies that drive manufacturing excellence today. The social changes initiated when women entered factories to work all night continued evolving through subsequent decades. Equal employment opportunities, workplace protections, childcare support, all of these modern expectations trace partial lineage to the moment when women proved they could handle any job men could do. The shock felt by German officers witnessing factories that never slept continues resonating through how we understand industrial capacity and national power. Modern military strategists still emphasize industrial base as a crucial component of military potential. Nations still measure their strength partially by manufacturing capacity and their ability to mobilize production rapidly in crisis. The lesson that those German officers learned so traumatically remains relevant. The competitive global economy of the 21st century operates on principles that were proven in American war factories. Global manufacturing runs continuously, supply chains span the world delivering materials exactly when needed, production is measured and optimized constantly. The modern world economy is, in some sense, an elaboration of principles that first proved themselves when American factories ran all night to defeat totalitarianism. Workers today still struggle with night shift challenges, still sacrifice time with family to keep production flowing, still face the health consequences of working against natural biological rhythms. We have better understanding of these costs now and better support systems. But the fundamental reality remains that continuous production demands human sacrifice from those who maintain it. In the end, the shock German officers experienced when they saw American factories running all night came down to a simple mathematical reality they could not escape. They calculated production rates per hour, multiplied by the number of factories, multiplied by the number of hours those factories operated, and arrived at totals that spelled doom for German hopes. The numbers were not abstract. Each number represented specific weapons that would be used against German forces. Every tank produced in a factory running through the night was a tank that would face German soldiers. Every bomber built during a midnight shift was a bomber that would drop explosives on German cities. Every ship launched at dawn after a night of continuous work was a ship that would carry more supplies to Allied armies. German officers did these calculations and understood that no amount of courage, no tactical brilliance, no technological innovation could overcome the crushing mathematical superiority represented by those factories that never slept. Some calculations were even more devastating. German officers could estimate how many tanks Germany produced per month and compare that to American output. They could calculate how long it would take to replace losses from a major battle. They realized that Germany could win individual battles, but would lose the war of attrition because every loss was irreplaceable while American losses were made good almost immediately. The arithmetic of survival had turned decisively against them. These calculations produced different reactions among different officers. Some descended into depression, seeing clearly that they fought for a doomed cause. Some retreated into denial, rejecting mathematical reality in favor of hope for miracles. Some became cooperative prisoners, deciding that helping end the war quickly would save lives on all sides. Some maintained discipline and faith despite the numbers, holding to duty even when victory became impossible. The shock they experienced was not merely emotional but intellectual, the shock of watching cherished assumptions shatter against factual reality. They had believed German superiority was natural and inevitable, but American factories running all night proved that belief fatally wrong. The cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality created psychological crises that some prisoners never fully resolved. The factories that ran all night consumed more than materials and labor. They consumed electricity on a scale that transformed American infrastructure and environmental impact. Keeping massive industrial facilities illuminated and operational 24 hours a day required enormous amounts of electrical power. This demand drove rapid expansion of electrical generation capacity and distribution networks during the war years. Power plants ran at maximum capacity, burning coal and oil to generate the electricity that kept factory lights blazing and machinery humming. The environmental cost was not calculated at the time because victory took absolute priority over environmental concerns, but the pollution produced by continuous industrial operation was staggering. Smoke from factory chimneys darkened skies day and night. Rivers used for industrial cooling became polluted with chemicals and heated water. The air quality in industrial cities deteriorated significantly. Workers and nearby residents suffered health consequences that were accepted as unavoidable costs of war production. The electrical infrastructure built to support wartime production became a permanent asset that powered post-war economic growth. But the environmental debt accumulated during those years took decades to recognize and begin addressing. The human cost in terms of health, respiratory problems from air pollution, cancers from chemical exposure, hearing loss from constant noise, affected millions of workers and nearby residents. These costs were invisible during the war, overlooked in the urgency of production, but they represented real suffering that continued long after the factories converted to peacetime production or closed entirely. Some workers who spent years breathing industrial air and handling toxic materials without adequate protection paid with shortened lives and chronic illness. The brightness of factory lights burning through the night also affected local communities in unexpected ways. Neighborhoods near major industrial facilities never experienced true darkness during the war years. The constant light pollution disrupted sleep for nearby residents, affected local wildlife, and created a strange perpetual twilight. Children growing up near these factories sometimes thought the lights were normal and were surprised to learn that nighttime was supposed to be dark. Yet despite all these costs, few who lived through those years regretted the sacrifice. They understood that the alternative, losing the war to fascist aggression, was unthinkable. The factories running all night represented hope and determination, proof that democracy could mobilize as effectively as totalitarianism when faced with existential threat. The environmental and health costs were real and significant, but they seemed small compared to the cost of defeat. Today, more than 8 decades after German officers first witnessed American factories operating all night, the story continues resonating in how Americans understand their history and identity. The image of those blazing factories has become part of national mythology, a symbol of American capacity to rise to challenges and achieve what seems impossible when truly committed to a cause. Veterans of the home front, now nearly all passed away, left behind oral histories and recorded memories that historians treasure. They described the exhaustion, the sense of purpose, the pride in knowing their work mattered. They spoke of friendships formed on night shift assembly lines, of shared determination that transcended differences of race and class. They remembered the moment when news of victory arrived and how they cried with relief and joy, knowing they had contributed directly to that victory. Their children and grandchildren carry forward these stories, preserving memory of a time when the nation unified around common purpose. In an era of division and cynicism, these stories offer reminders that Americans have achieved remarkable things when working together. The factories that ran all night become metaphors for potential that exists when petty differences are set aside in service of something larger. The story also serves as warning about the costs of underestimating opponents and allowing ideology to override realistic assessment. The shock those German officers experienced reminds us that prejudice and assumption are dangerous foundations for strategy. Nations and peoples should be assessed by their potential rather than stereotypes, by what they might become when challenged rather than how they appear in peaceful times. Museums and historical sites preserve some of the physical locations where these factories operated. The Willow Run plant, though mostly demolished, has a preserved section that serves as a museum. Visitors can stand where bombers were once assembled around the clock and try to imagine the noise, the activity, the urgent purposefulness that filled the space day and night. Photographs and documentary footage provide glimpses of what those German officers witnessed. The impossible sight of factory after factory blazing with light through the darkness, assembly lines that never stopped, workers moving with determined efficiency through every hour of the night. These images preserve visual evidence of an industrial mobilization whose scale has never been matched before or since. For 4 years, from late 1941 until August 1945, American factories maintained a pace that seemed unsustainable yet somehow continued month after month. The lights never went out. The assembly lines never stopped. The workers kept coming, shift after shift, producing the materials that supplied not just American forces but allies around the world. It was as if the entire American industrial system had taken a deep breath and held it for 4 years, pouring out every ounce of energy and capability without pause for rest. The cumulative exhaustion must have been extraordinary. By 1945, workers had been maintaining this pace for years. Machinery was worn from continuous use. Supply systems were stretched thin. Everyone was tired, depleted, running on determination and stubbornness more than fresh energy. Yet production continued, even increased, right up until the moment victory was achieved. When the war finally ended, the release of tension was almost explosive. Factories that had run continuously for years finally shut down for celebrations. Workers who had driven themselves to exhaustion finally rested. The lights that had blazed through countless nights finally went dark, at least temporarily. The night shift workers went home and slept for days, making up years of sleep debt in marathon rest sessions. But even as factories shut down or converted to peacetime production, the memory remained. America had proven something fundamental about its character and capabilities. When challenged by existential threat, when united by clear purpose, when motivated by defensive values and protection of allies, America could mobilize industrial capacity that overwhelmed any opponent. The factories running all night were not just producing weapons, they were making a statement about national will and determination that echoed around the world. That statement was heard most clearly by German officers who witnessed it directly, who stood in the night and watched the impossible become real. They carried that memory home with them, a permanent reminder of the catastrophic miscalculation that had doomed their nation's aggressive ambitions. They had learned too late that America's peaceful appearance masked potential that became overwhelming when awakened. The impact of factories running all night during World War II extended far beyond military victory to shape American society and economy for generations. The workers who maintained those exhausting shifts developed skills and work ethics that served them throughout their lives. They carried pride in their contributions that sustained them through post-war decades. They taught their children about sacrifice, purpose, and the importance of contributing to something larger than individual concerns. The industrial infrastructure built or expanded to support wartime production became the foundation for post-war economic dominance. American manufacturing led the world for decades after the war, partially because the investments made during the conflict created capacity that exceeded any competitor. The organizational and technological innovations developed to sustain continuous production gave American industry advantages that persisted long after the war ended. The social changes initiated when women and minorities entered war factories in large numbers continued evolving through subsequent generations. The civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and labor organizing efforts all drew on the proof provided during the war that excluded groups were capable of full participation when given opportunity. The argument that women or African Americans were inherently incapable of industrial work could never again be made seriously after their wartime contributions. The educational benefits provided to veterans through the GI Bill, combined with savings accumulated from wartime factory work, allowed millions of Americans to afford college and homes that had been impossible dreams before the war. This created a broad middle class and generational wealth accumulation that shaped American society for decades. Workers who had operated factory machinery during the war became engineers, teachers, business owners, and professionals after the war, using skills and savings gained through those exhausting night shifts. The American confidence and optimism that characterized the 1950s and 60s was built partially on memory of what had been achieved during the war. If American industry could produce miracles when needed, if ordinary citizens could rise to extraordinary challenges, if the nation could defeat powerful enemies through sheer determination and capability, then surely any problem could be solved with sufficient effort. This confidence eventually proved excessive and led to mistakes, but it originated in real achievements symbolized by those factories that ran all night. In the final analysis, the story of German officers shocked by American factories running all night is a story about human potential and the dangers of underestimating it. Those German officers came from a system that claimed to understand human nature, that organized society according to theories about racial capacity and national character, that had built an empire on assumptions about who was strong and who was weak. Every assumption proved wrong when tested against the reality of American industrial mobilization. The factories that blazed through countless nights were built by workers from every background and ethnicity, powered by an electrical grid that spanned a continent, supplied by a logistics network that coordinated millions of shipments, producing weapons designed by engineers from diverse educational backgrounds. This diversity, which Nazi ideology saw as weakness, proved to be tremendous strength. Innovation came from unexpected sources. Solutions to production problems came from workers on the factory floor as often as from management offices. The very flexibility and creativity that rigid systems disparage became decisive advantages. The shock those German officers experienced was fundamentally the shock of watching their worldview crumble. They had been taught that discipline and order would triumph, that racial purity created superiority, that authoritarian control was more efficient than democratic chaos. The factories running all night proved every teaching wrong. Democracy mobilized more effectively than dictatorship. Diversity generated more innovation than uniformity. Workers fighting for values they believed in produced more than conscripted labor under totalitarian control. This was not the lesson German leadership wanted to learn, but it was the lesson history delivered with crushing finality. The verdict was written in production statistics, pronounced in the roar of machinery that never slept, and delivered by armies equipped with overwhelming material superiority. The German officers who witnessed American factories operating through the night carried home testimony that should have prevented future conflicts. They had seen what industrial capacity mobilized by free societies could achieve. They understood that no nation could survive a conflict against such productive power. This knowledge, purchased at catastrophic cost, remains relevant today as a warning against aggression and a reminder that apparent weakness may conceal extraordinary strength waiting to be awakened. When the last factory lights finally dimmed after victory was achieved, when the final night shift ended and workers went home knowing they would not return the next evening, when the assembly lines stopped for the last time, a remarkable chapter in American history closed. The factories had run all night for years, producing miracles through exhausting determination, and now they could rest. The workers could rest. The nation could rest, at least briefly, before the challenges of peace demanded new efforts. But something had changed permanently. America had discovered capabilities that could not be forgotten. Workers had proven dedication that could not be dismissed. The nation had demonstrated potential that would shape international relations for generations. The shock those German officers experienced when they first witnessed factories blazing through darkness had been justified. They had seen the future of industrial warfare and the obsolescence of their own assumptions. The lights that burned through so many nights became symbols of multiple truths. They represented American determination to defend freedom against tyranny. They demonstrated the power of industrial capacity in modern warfare. They proved that democracy could mobilize as effectively as dictatorship when facing existential threat. They showed that diversity was strength rather than weakness. They testified to the courage and sacrifice of ordinary workers who transformed themselves into the arsenal of democracy. Today, when we look back at photographs of those factories operating through the night, when we read accounts of German officers standing in shocked silence as they comprehended what they were seeing, we remember a time when America rose to meet an enormous challenge and exceeded even optimistic expectations. We remember workers who sacrificed sleep, health, and family time to produce the weapons that defended freedom. We remember a generation that understood clearly what was at stake and decided that no sacrifice was too great to ensure victory. The factories running all night were more than industrial facilities. They were monuments to human determination, evidence of what free people can achieve when united by common purpose, and symbols of the terrible miscalculation made by those who assumed America was weak and incapable of sustained effort. The German officers who witnessed this industrial miracle carried home a truth learned too late to save their nation. Never underestimate the sleeping giant, for when awakened, its capacity exceeds all predictions and its determination cannot be broken. That lesson, written in light and steel and ceaseless labor through countless nights, remains one of history's most powerful testaments to the strength that lies dormant in free societies, until challenged by forces that threaten everything they hold dear.